So to close out our discussion of BDD, I want to revisit some fallacies and pitfalls, things that can go wrong if you're not careful, and things that can go wrong even if you are careful. That's the difference between a fallacy is something that you actually believe it might be true, but it's not true. A pitfall is you know something is true and you're careful, but it might happen anyway. So in terms of the general methodology of assigning points and using that to measure progress, what are some things that you should be on the lookout for? Don't use velocity to compare teams. The only meaning of points and velocity is within each team. So your team gets to the point where they figure out a 1-point story is, let's say, something that 2 developers or a pair of developers can finish in an afternoon. Another team might have a different estimate for it. So one team's velocity has really very little to do with the other team's velocity. The only reason for velocity is for your team to estimate how much work you're going to get done in the upcoming iterations. Assigning 3 or more points to stories whose complexity you're unsure of. As I said, this is one reason that in my use of tools like Pivotal Tracker, I do not allow more than 3 points to be an assignable number. It maxes out at 3. And if I'm assigning 3 points to a story, I better make sure that I know why exactly it's 3 points, right? So it's not that I don't know how complex it is. It's that there's an element of complexity in the story that is similar to something I've seen before. And the last time I saw it, it was a 3-point story. Finished, delivered, and accepted. In Agile, these are really important because they're different. Finished just means that from the point of view of a person working on a story, the tests and the code are ready to be reviewed by the rest of the team. Delivered means that it's ready to be reviewed by the customer and it's been deployed in such a way that the customer can directly interact with it. And as we emphasize in 169L, that does not mean you take the laptop to a customer meeting and you show them a demo of the prototype feature on your laptop. It means you deploy the app in such a way that the customer can interact with it directly, whether it's in the cloud or some other way. And only after the customer has said, yes, this looks good to me, then the story is accepted. So those 3 states are actually quite important. And a story that took a relatively short time to be finished might actually spend just as long in the delivered state before it goes to accepted if the customer has tweaks that they wanted. In fact, I think in my experience, it is more common for there to be some tweaks between the story being delivered and the story being accepted. And often where those tweaks come from is implicit requirements that just weren't obvious when the customer and I agreed on what the story was. And so when it's deployed, they said, oh, you know what? In this case that we didn't think of, I actually think that the view should look like this. And so I have to go back and make little adjustments. And the story remains in the delivered state until the customer says, okay, now it looks good. And then it goes to accepted. And that's also when the code for that story is deployed to the production server, right? All of this negotiation is taking place on a staging server somewhere else. Dividing work by layers versus dividing work by stories within a team. This is one of my favorite ones. Basically, dividing work by layers is when your team says, okay, you're the database person, you just do the active record part. You know JavaScript, so you do the front end part. You work on the controller logic. As opposed to in a story where a developer or maybe a pair of developers says, this story is going to touch every part of the app. There's a user interface aspect, there's a controller aspect, there's an active record aspect. We will be responsible for every piece of that vertically sliced. And a reason to divide work by stories, and there's many reasons, but one of them is it's harder to coordinate a single story that has pieces at multiple layers if different people are working on it. Just the communication overhead goes up. But I think more importantly, in my point of view, is that if every member of the team is routinely touching every part of the app, you all become familiar with what the different parts of the app do. There's something called the truck factor. It's a little bit morbid, but it's basically what percentage of your team, if run over by a truck, would cause the project to go into jeopardy. So if you have a low truck factor, it means that there's a small number of people on your team that in some sense are critical. If those people went away or left the project, it would be really hard for the rest of the team to sort of recover that work because those 2 people had some unique understanding of parts of the app that nobody else had. So having a bad truck factor is something you want to avoid. In fact, again, this is from students who have taken these courses before. This is one of the things that they brought up as advice they would give to other students, that when they divided work using stories, it helped everybody on the team understand different parts of the app. And so everybody was more comfortable when a new feature had to be done, when they had to make other changes. As I mentioned, we do use Pivotal Tracker in that course. And the students found that using stories as the unit of estimation rather than layers as the unit of estimation helped them to better prioritize the features and estimate difficulty. Students who didn't do this found that it was hard to coordinate getting features to work because the parts of the team that were working on different parts of the same story essentially weren't talking to each other enough. And also, if you want the work to be divided fairly, so everybody is sort of, doing their share of the work, it's harder to do that by layers. At least one student team said, we're not sure if we ended up getting better at estimating difficulty over time. And as we said, one of the major reasons to do work in this way is that you do get better at estimating it. And that translates into having some confidence when you're talking to the customer about what you're going to get done. How about features with using Cucumber and Capybara? Again, we covered only sort of a very basic Cucumber and Capybara scenarios, but immediately we saw that the careless use of expectations, both negative and positive. So a negative expectation is a step definition or a step that says something like, when something happens, then I should not see something on the page. Remember that there are many, many ways to not see something on the page, and most of those ways are not what your test is about. So be very careful. If you're saying, then I should not see, at the very least, consider combining it in the same scenario with another step that says, but I should see. So you're basically getting some sanity check that you're on the right page, you're generally seeing the right content, but you're verifying that some specific piece of content is absent from the page. Similarly, for positive expectations, that was the example that we did in the demo where we said, the strings occurred on the page, but they didn't occur in the right place. And the initial simple version of our step definition didn't check for that. So when you're saying, if I should see something on a page, are you sure you're looking at the right place on the page? What if it occurs more than one time, even within that same place? Is that okay? Or is that something you actually want to check for? One of the things that you'll find in websteps.rb is a slightly more refined version of I should see, which is that I should see something within something, which basically just does what we did by hand in the demo. It scopes the I should see to a particular part of the page. But like I said, better still is to look at the domain language of your page and write something like, then I should see whatever within the list of students or within the grid of movie reviews. Some language that makes sense for your app, and just by reading it, it's very obvious what it's supposed to mean. And finally, another pitfall, kind of a standard one, but it's worth pointing out, is testing only the happy path. The happy path is what we call the case where the user is behaving really nicely and they only use the app the way that you intended it to be used. They go through the pages in order, they fill in a legal value on every form field that they have to fill in. And of course, we know that a lot of time users don't do that. They'll use, my favorite is the sites that say, don't use the back button on your browser. I mean, you can't control that, right? People are going to do it. They know what the back button does. They accidentally click something that they didn't mean to click. They're going to use the back button because they think it's going to help. So testing the sad path is trying to think of ways that users might plausibly misuse your app and making sure that it does something sensible and something defensible in those cases. As you learn more about Cucumber and Capybara, you will find many more pitfalls, but you will actually find, I think, that they're an immensely powerful pair of tools, both for doing integration level testing, like actually having tests that cover entire workflows in the app in a realistic manner, but also, as we said, where the user stories comes from is a way to come to agreement with the customer on behavior in a way that doesn't require the customer to be technical. So I think once you get used to using it, it's a little bit weird the first few times you do it, but I have kind of become addicted to Cucumber. Not to cucumbers. I hate cucumbers, but I've become addicted to the tool. It helps me think about the code that I want to write. It helps me communicate with my customers and make sure that we're actually on the same page. And there's something very satisfying about seeing a scenario run and knowing that that scenario is doing exactly what the user would do and everything's green and it works, right? That gives you a level of confidence that when you deploy the app, at least those paths that you checked, the users will get the behavior that they're expecting.